MiniWarGaming's The Utgard Infestation!
Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to a storytime interlude for the Utgard Infestation 40k narrative campaign featuring the Adeptus Sororitas, or the Battle Sisters, or Sisters of Battle, against a Genestealer cult, a custom codex, if you will, that I've created especially for this campaign. Now, in this interlude, I'm going to talk about Genestealer cults in general. I've talked about them in previous videos, especially in a previous Tyranid video series that I did, Shadows in the Warp, but I want to go into more detail of exactly why the Genestealer cult is both terrifying and really neat in the lore of Warhammer 40k. So a Genestealer cult, this is one of the original things from old 40k background stuff. They haven't been talked about as much in recent Tyranid codexes. They're still there. They still mention them with Genestealers and all that, so they haven't removed it from the canon, which is good because I find it to be a really superb aspect of the Tyranids. It gives them much more diversity than their current. Right now at the Tyranid Hive, it's very straightforward. They want to consume, they approach a world, they seed it, they adapt to the defenses, and then they destroy the defenses, and then they consume all the biomass in the world, and then they move on to the next. And that's terrifying enough, and it makes them a really good villain, I find, in a lot of campaigns. But at the same time, they're very one-dimensional. A Genestealer cult, on the other hand, is a way that you can take Tyranids and make them much more multi-dimensional. Because here's how a Genestealer cult works. Well, first off, if you're not already familiar with Genestealers are an organism in the Tyranid Hive. And they are different from the other organisms in that they can operate independent from the hive mind. Whereas all the other organisms require nearby synapse creatures or synapse ships in order to keep them tied to the hive mind, a Genestealer can actually go away from that influence and still operate with the proper instincts. Of course, when it's near a synapse creature, it's totally under the will of the hive mind and will act with that singular purpose to destroy and consume. But that's not where a Genestealer is most terrifying. They are most terrifying when on their own. The Genestealer has a natural instinct to flee a hive fleet before they get close enough to be able to bring them into their grasp. And Genestealers have been found on worlds long before the Tyranids ever arrived in our galaxy, or at least from what we assume was the first contact with Tyranids in our galaxy. Who knows, there might have been Tyranid fleets that arrived here long ago. We don't know anything about that. But Genestealers have been here for as long as we can remember. A Genestealer is not just able to act independently, but is able to do a specific infestation. It's actually why it's called a Genestealer. It's not genes like the pants jeans, but genes as in Gene. And what they do is that they're masters of stealth, first off. They will stow away on ships and arrive at a new world ripe for infestation and consumption of a hive fleet. But the hive fleet wants minimal resistance, so it doesn't have to expend too much energy in order to incorporate more. So what a Genestealer will do is, first off, a single Genestealer, if it arrives in a world, could eventually herald the destruction of that entire world. And what it'll do is it'll hide in the underbellies of the cities, in the sewers or whatever, because it's obviously not human. It's got 4 arms, it's crouched over, and it's kind of larger than a human, and its face, it's so obviously alien that it has to hide. But a Genestealer has the ability to hypnotize others or to mind control others. And so what it will slowly do is not kill a bunch of people, because that would just draw attention to itself, but instead start to enthrall people and start to hypnotize them and bring them under its grasp. So let's just do an assumption that only one Genestealer makes it to a world rather than multiple. So what this one Genestealer will do is it'll go around and start to draw people into its clutches. And then a couple things happen at this point. One, it'll implant genetic material into these host bodies. And those host bodies, the next time they have a child, the first child that they have will actually be a Genestealer. And it'll be a second generation Genestealer. The first generation Genestealer is that original Genestealer, and it looks just like a Genestealer that you see in pictures or the models of the Tyranid Genestealers. But the second generation one is this weird crossbreed. It still looks very Genestealer-ish, but it starts to incorporate a few of the traits of its host. In this case, we're talking about humans, but it could be anything. It could be Eldar, it could be Orc, it could be Tau. It really could be any of the species. But of course, we're focusing on humans, and specifically the Imperium in our campaign. So we'll kind of talk in that vein, in that point of view. And so it starts to do that, but the problem is it's still going to attract attention if it just has all these people in its clutch. So what they'll usually do is they will find an area far away from civilization, basically, far away from the hive worlds of the Imperium, out in the country, as you will. And it starts what appears to just be a bit of a religious movement, just this harmless religious movement. In fact, they can even be good, like they can do good to people around them, just to have this guise of something that is actually good. And they slowly capture more and more people, hypnotizing more and more. Oh, and the second generation Genestealers who are born are totally psychically tied to that original Genestealer. They are tied to his will, and they have this brood telepathy that they have. Their will is totally for the Genestealer. They don't have any of their own independent will to go off and do what they want. And then those second generation Genestealers will have children, which become a third generation Genestealer. Third generation Genestealer will look even more human. It might only have 3 limbs instead of its 4, and it's going to start to stand up more. And if you actually put a robe over top of them and make it look kind of like the monks or whatever of the religion, you can even get away with it passing as human. So if you're looking from a distance and spying on their convents or whatever you want to call them, on their monasteries, they actually would kind of look human going around. Of course, they'll keep their faces covered, because if you look at their face and you can see that they're discolored and their eyes have this very weird look to them, you'll know that they're actually alien, which of course the Imperium is not very tolerant of. But what gets the most terrifying is once they get to the 4th generation Genestealer. The 4th generation Genestealer is almost indistinguishable from humans. It'll look exactly like a human, except if you were to look into its eyes, you would be able to tell that something is not quite right. And then you might get hypnotized right after that, because that is actually how they get into your head, is that they actually look through and have a hypnotic gaze. And that's how they enthrall the weak-minded of the Imperium. But the reason the 4th generation Genestealers are so terrifying is because they can just go right into society and nobody knows the difference. They could just get a job in the police force. They could take up politics, which a lot of them do. They basically can infiltrate society in all of its tiers. They can be a low-level worker. They can be the owner of a business. They can influence gangs and try to get them to do stuff that they want them to. They can be a politician, or even in extreme cases, they could be in the upper echelons of society, and maybe even eventually the governor himself. Although that is very rare. If that happens, then usually the planet is totally doomed. And so what they'll do is they'll then move back into society and start to infiltrate it as much as possible, capturing more and more. They'll actually attempt to take control of the planet through non-violent means first, because as soon as you do violent means, then you're going to attract the attention of the local militia, the garrisons, any space marines or sisters of battle in this case that are nearby. Or worse, an inquisitor, which you don't want to attract the attention of. You just want to do it all through political means. Because in the end, the Imperium doesn't really care about the politics of an individual world. As long as that world supplies a tithe of soldiers and whatever it's designed to do, if it's an agricultural world, as long as it supplies food, if it's a forge world, as long as it's supplying the tanks, if it's a munitions world, as long as it's supplying munitions, they don't care what the governor does. They don't care how he works. As long as he's loyal to the Emperor and pays his tithes, then they'll let him kind of govern however he wants. And so the Genestealer cult takes advantage of this, because as long as they keep the Imperium happy, they could take over the entire political system of a world. And so that's what they'll try to do first. If they are discovered, or if the political attempts fail, then they'll start to resort to violence. And that's where they'll start to influence local gangs, they'll start rebellions, whatever they can to try to take over the world by those means. Now that's a little more dangerous to the Genestealer cult, because it does expose them a bit more, as it does attract the attention of the Imperium, because a world in rebellion is not going to be able to provide its tithes and all the other things it needs to do. But they'll still attempt to do it. In some cases, Genestealer cults have been so successful in taking over a world that when a hive fleet arrives, the world's occupants actually hail them as saviors from their mortal lives. And the hive ships don't even have to attack the world, they just land, and everybody willingly boards the hive ships to be consumed. And of course, that's very terrifying a thought. Usually they don't get that far. Usually they just get far enough that they cause so much problems that the defenses of the planet are undermined. So that leads us to the last part of what is terrifying about a Genestealer cult. This original Genestealer becomes what is called a patriarch. And the larger his following, the more powerful he becomes, especially psychically. So this brood telepathy forms a kind of psychic choir, if you will, that creates a beacon. And the more successful they are, the stronger this beacon gets and the brighter it shines through the warp. And who sees it through the warp? Well, the hive mind. And if there's a hive fleet close enough to sense that beacon, they will naturally get drawn to it. Because what's happening is if that beacon is strong, the Genestealer cult is being successful, which means the world will be easy pickings. And the hive fleet, as it approaches, once it gets close, the Genestealers will sense the approach to the hive fleet and naturally have an instinct to try to flee. Well, thankfully, as the hive fleet approaches, there is mass panic usually on a world, and all sorts of people are trying to flee, and so all sorts of ships are leaving, and it's very easy for Genestealers to stow away, to go to new planets, and start the cycle all over again. Of course, when the hive fleet arrives, there's still plenty of the Genestealers on the world, and it can exert its will and simultaneously can tell the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of fourth generation Genestealers and everything else that's on the planet to simultaneously attack. And they can just all of a sudden, you can be standing in a room and there's a couple people in the room who just all of a sudden start opening fire, and it's just mass mayhem, defenses get undermined, and all the Genestealers pop up from the sewers and start start attacking everybody, and it becomes such mass chaos that it usually is super easy for the hive fleet to come and consume that world if it's been infested by Genestealers. Of course, hive fleets will consume worlds that haven't been infested by Genestealers if they're in their path, but they especially like the ones that have the Genestealers on it, as they know it'll be a much, much easier world to do. So you can see why the Imperium is worried whenever it finds a Genestealer cult, because by the time it finds one, it's in the very late stages of infestation. And if it's too far gone, then that beacon's going to draw on a hive fleet, and they are going to come and they're going to consume the world quite easily. And in a lot of cases, if the Genestealer infestation gets too far, an Inquisitor, if they are there and investigating it, will have to get off world and has no other choice but to order an exterminatus and just wipe the planet clean of all life, because it's better for them to be killed than for the hive fleet to come and consume them and grow in strength. So that is our Storytime interlude for today. Stay tuned for more Utgard Infestation, the 40k narrative campaign featuring the Adeptus Sororitas and Genestealer Cult, coming this coming Thursday. Thanks for watching, and happy wargaming.